How did I believe this stuff for so long?
When is it ever wise to believe what you're told without question?
Doubt becomes our mechanism for determining what is true and what is not.
Biblical literalists are forbidden to admit that the Bible could ever be wrong about anything, which is why so many apologists are employed full-time trying to conceal all the many errors of Scripture.
When you appeal to gods to try to solve these questions, they may pacify, but that's separate from whether or not it's actually true.
Generations of human beings have just gotten punked. We're victims of our own superstitious joke. Question everything. So you can say, I want to go out and find out what the truth is.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for that wonderful introduction. I think each of us in the Unholy Trinity has a different specialty. Seth usually promotes humanism, and Matt pitches skepticism while I defend science education. And though there is some obvious overlap, I think all of us have a favorite criticism of religion, too, whether it is to show how illogical, irrational, or immoral it is, as Seth most often does. While Matt typically points out hypocrisy, logical fallacies, absurdities, atrocities, inconsistencies, and contradictions. And my favorite topic is the intellectual dishonesty and injustice of enforcing a belief system demanding that you believe this and not that. If you question the accuracy of it, that's heresy. If you question the truth of it, that's apostasy. Both are punishable by death. So you better believe exactly what you're told just because you're told to, or else you face the threat of a fate worse than death. Penalizing thought crimes this way, the way the belief systems do, deprives us of one of our most basic human rights, the right to think and to reason, to accept or reject what we will for whatever reasons make sense to us. We have to be free to make up our own minds and to change them when we feel that that is warranted. Being able to think freely is the most basic liberty there is, yet this is what religion denies us. Imagine refusing to learn forbidden knowledge out of the fear that you might understand it, and thus risk accepting what you dare not believe. Because we're told that this is how faith robs you or prohibits reason. And it praises us for being unreasonable, because we're told that it is a virtue to believe impossible nonsense for no good reason and to defend delusion against all reason. There's so much wrong with religion, any of them, all of them, that there's a wealth of flaws to attack and correct. I prefer to tackle religious extremism, especially creationism, because creationists at least claim to be biblical literalists, until you point out all the times that they can't be. And that's why no one reads the Bible as literally as atheists do. I don't care about comparing the various interpretations of Scripture, because believers can twist their holy books into saying anything that they want, reading between the lines and then ignoring the lines. That when it says this, it really means that, but only in this chapter, unless I arbitrarily decide otherwise for reasons that I'll make up later. Unless you corner me in something indefensible, in which case the Bible is absolutely literal, except for all the places where God only knows when it's only metaphorical. In one context, but conveniently not when I need it to be literal again, like when I want to use the same verse to argue a different topic with a different person. Otherwise, it is the infallible and unalterable Word of God, except for all the errors and eccentricities that were added in or edited out by its many fallible human translators, interpolators, and alleged authors. We give them names and call them eyewitnesses, even though we know that the mostly anonymous writers were not really there, and they weren't who we say they were either. To make it even worse, the Bible is written in prophetic language, so that any particular story is clearly talking about this one character, except for this one sentence in there somewhere that has to be taken completely out of context to be erroneously interpreted as if it's a secretly prophetic reference to this other character in another story that has nothing at all to do with this one. Look at Psalm 22:16 or Isaiah 7:14, for example. In either case, just that one sentence is supposedly prophecy, but it doesn't prophesy anything because it didn't inform the people reading it then as to what was going to happen or by when. It's just a line that accidentally reminds us of another story later on because of a mistranslation. So we pretend that there are no accidents and that it was always supposed to mean that, even to the people who read it back then. Why? Because reasons. No. Prophecy is when someone predicts that a particular thing is going to happen, like after this event, but before this predetermined time, so that everybody knows what to expect and when to expect it. Otherwise, you're just retrofitting laughable folklore into a new understanding, like when we rationalize some way that your horoscope didn't technically get everything wrong. It's just like when Nostradamus said something about a guy named Hitler. Hitler? He must have meant Hitler. Nostradamus could see the future, but he couldn't spell it. And he left out all the important details, such that even if his predictions were right, they'd still be meaningless. That's why they assure us now that whenever it says that God stretched out the skies, that it's really talking about cosmic inflation, like what you scientists are talking about now, but the modern science is just now starting to figure that out. No, that's not what that means. When it said that God stretched out the skies, it meant that he had a cloak that had the stars sewn into it that he would drape over our sky. And our sky was a giant crystal dome, this is how the Bible describes it, with windows in it to let the rain in because they thought that space was full of water. And that this giant dome fits over a flat earth. And inside this dome is the sun and the moon traveling about together. They're both the same size as each other, both smaller than the earth, but both bigger than all of the other stars. That's what it meant back then, and it's just as wrong now as it was when those people read it. And the reason that the Bible got all of that wrong was because it wasn't the Word of God. It was written by ignorant, bigoted, superstitious savages who obviously had no idea what they were talking about ever. There are actual prophecies in the Bible, like when Ezekiel said that Nebuchadnezzar would utterly destroy the kingdom of Egypt, that no man nor beast would ever set foot there for 40 years. Here we have a specific event and a time limit so we know that when it didn't happen. Because you have to have a time limit for it to be a proper prophecy. Otherwise, anything that can happen will happen if you give it enough time. Eventually, Egypt will be a desolate wasteland wherein no man nor beast will trod. It might be billions of years from now when the sun goes nova, but it will happen, right? However, we know that the armies of Iron Age warlords won't have anything to do with that. When Nebuchadnezzar died, or when this Nebuchadnezzar died, then a few, or at least a couple, of Ezekiel's prophecies failed. The problem with arguing over Scripture is that if you don't interpret it the same way that the other guy does, the one that you're arguing with, then you're just wrong. Your interpretation is wrong. And neither one of you has to prove it because you have to prove the other guy wrong. How do you prove another guy's interpretation wrong? I can only argue what the thing actually says, not what you interpret, some strained interpretation of what you think it might have meant. Especially when each of the words have a symbolic meaning and that the meaning might change depending on whoever reads it. I don't like discussing philosophy either, for much the same reason. I'll consider any possibility as long as you can show me that such a possibility exists, to show me that it is possible. But if I ask to verify anything that you've said, then believers want to accuse me of subscribing to verificationism, which I don't think is the case. I just don't want to be fooled into believing a lie. Religious people tell an awful lot of lies, and so you have to fact check them, anytime they tell you something that is difficult to believe. If there is no fact that indicates or supports whatever they're selling, then it's just baseless speculation, dishonestly asserted as though it were a fact. In any other field of study, that would be called lying, but in religion, it's called revelation of absolute truth. Because everyone's interpretation is divine revelation or divine inspiration, even when it contradicts what everybody else said when they said that God told them something different. If faith doesn't require evidence, it refuses to acknowledge evidence against it too. And the faithful seem unable to understand the opposing position, where I don't want to make believe that things are however I want them to be. I want to know how they really are, which means I have to improve my understanding, which means I have to figure out where I am wrong. My information has to be correct, and if it's not, it's useless. I often say that the only value information can have is in how accurate you can show it to be. And if you can't show that it is accurate at all, then it has no value at all. Now think about that in relation to every sermon you've ever heard. I can't believe something until or unless the evidence is sufficient to change my mind. And my mind must obligately change when I see that the evidence is against my position. And you don't even have to disprove my position. When you argue with religious believers, they don't demand any evidence at all for what they believe, but they want absolute 100% solid disproof of what they believe, right? That's what they demand, a complete double standard. You don't have to disprove my position. It's enough to know that it's not really supported, because an unsupported claim has no more credence than a claim that has already been proven wrong. They both have zero credence. And we don't give the benefit of the doubt when all you have is doubt and there's no reason to believe it. So I get falsely accused of verificationism, which my interlocutors then use to assume that I'm a logical positivist, regardless what I actually think. And then they say that logical positivism fell out of favor in the 20th century. As if that's a rebuttal to a position I never had in the first place. And then they bring up their philosopher from the 13th century, as if that's better. And they balk when I call them and raise them with a newer, better philosopher from the 18th century because reasons, or lack thereof. Because in philosophy, there's tons of disagreement with different pontificators arguing with each other because everybody's opinion is equally valid, and that's why I think religious people like philosophy so much, because everyone can believe whatever they want, and there's often no way to prove one position right or wrong. That's why the philosophers are arguing unendingly. But you can do that with science. And I like to argue a position where I can prove whether I'm right or wrong. So instead of debating philosophy or theology, where it's just a matter of personal opinion or nebulous interpretation, I take on creationism, because that's something I can prove is absolutely wrong about absolutely everything they claim that is contrary to science. And there's no ambiguity about that. As this audience may be aware, 3 days ago, Wednesday, February 12th, was Darwin Day, being Darwin's 161st birthday. So, of course, I'm obligated to say something about that at this gathering. When Darwin dropped his revolutionary evolutionary theory into the pool of human knowledge, the shockwave caused ripples that turned into tsunamis throughout biology, paleontology, and sociology, but also in economics, as well as philosophy and theology. And it wasn't just that scholars praised him for having found a working explanation that others had been working on trying to figure out for decades before him. It was more religious people criticizing him for having provided an answer when they did not want one, when they would rather have no answer at all. So many Christians want to say that I'm wrong about this, but they know that I'm right. That faith means that believers don't need evidence that what they want to believe is true. They're going to believe it anyway, and they're perfectly happy to. What they don't want and can't tolerate is evidence that what they believe is wrong, because they know that the best argument they ever had for God was whenever science couldn't explain something. Therefore, believers think we can safely assume that it must be a magical miracle or miraculous magic. Sure, it's only a fallacious argument from ignorance, but it's the best they've got, and it's all they need when no one knows any better. Until science has explained that, and now they've got a problem. Because defenders of the faith are still going to believe what they want to anyway, even if they know it's not true, and I've gotten people to admit that to me in a number of different ways, paraphrased different ways. But now they have to do more work to hide or to lie about the evidence against them. Irrational people don't want to know what they don't want to believe, so they're incurious. They're not going to investigate or inquire. They're certainly not going to test anything or seriously question their own assumptions because they don't want to find out that they're wrong. That's why they only ask you questions they think you can't answer. For example, a few days ago, some religious zealot challenged me to address his list of 7 things that he thinks none of you can answer, that no atheist ever has nor ever could answer any of these things. You ready? Number 1, explain how information came from matter. I'd like to see an explanation for how information comes any other way. But by one definition, information is just data that is provided by our senses. So there's literally no other possible option to convey information or to learn anything without relying entirely on matter. And in another sense, many physicists say that matter is made of information anyway. So right to begin with, so it's a perpetual loop. Number 2, explain how atheists have absolutely no absolutes. We do have some absolutes. For example, radiometric dating is absolute, though they don't want to admit that. And we're absolutely certain that there was never a global flood for Noah's Ark. Absolute certain about that too. But there are a lot of things that are not the absolute dichotomies that they make them out to be. For example, number 3, explain how intelligence comes from non-intelligence. Well, it's not binary. Have you noticed when you argue with religious people, it's always this or that, right? It's got to be one or the other. They don't understand what a bell curve is or how that works. So it's not like you're intelligent until you flip a switch, or you're not intelligent until you flip a switch and then you are, right? Although there are some things that'll flip a switch and then you're not. It's more like gradations it's a metric on a scale, right? Where intelligence is measured usually in correlation with the number of synapses or neurons that you have and how they interact with each other. But we know that there are some organisms, very primitive organisms, that have a measurable degree of intelligence even though they don't have brains or neurons or anything like that. Number 4, explain how you can get morals from nothing. Yeah, this is the argument I hate most. You know, it's one of the arguments I hate most. I have a collection of favorites. When they tell you, you atheists think everything came from nothing. Except I don't know an atheist who believes that. Not even Lawrence Krauss believes that. Right? Most of atheists in general don't believe that an absolute nothing is even possible. So we don't think anything came from nothing. Any believers watching this on video, stop telling that lie. We get our morality from our evolution as a social species, wherein our survival depends on our interaction with other people, and society applies very strong selective pressures, and I'm talking about natural selection, selective pressures, on us to develop a natural empathy for our family, friends, and fellows. This is where morality comes from. You don't want to piss off all of your peers by being mean to everybody around you, because we know that there's this, even if karma doesn't really exist, society will still visit that back on you. And people who are this kind of defect in how poorly they treat other people tend to be ostracized from the gene pool by being imprisoned, by being banished, or by being killed. So we see how natural selection develops a type of morality. That's where it really comes from, not from thou shalt not, especially when none of our laws reflect that. Number 5, and I'm not sure exactly how he was phrasing the question. He wanted me to explain no truth. So I'm going to interpret that he meant to explain the lack of truth, or how atheists have no truth. I have no idea what he's talking about, but there is truth. I'm addressing the believer now. There is truth, just not in your religion, nor in any other religion either. The truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true. So when you assert baseless speculation as though it were fact, pretending to know things you don't really know, that's a lie. That's not truth, but that's what religion does. That's what all religions do. So you don't have truth, but we do, because we can show the truth of our position where you cannot. Number 5, explain materialism. I've heard from a number of different people different definitions of what they think materialism is. And there's a wide variance here, but I'm going with, I think, the most standard definition. Materialism is the position that matter, including energy, is the basis of nature, and that everything, even consciousness, is fundamentally material. And we can prove that by showing that chemical drugs, trauma to the brain, or surgery on the brain can effectively alter personality and mentality, where this would not be the case if the mind actually came from some immaterial, supernatural source that doesn't have anything to do with chemicals, and so you still wouldn't matter what your personality is if you have trauma to the brain. It only affects your personality because the brain is the source of your mind. That supernatural aspect of the universe has often been suggested, but has never been verified or indicated by any means anywhere ever. If anyone thinks that my simple explanation in brevity is unsatisfactory because it's too short, I will be giving a much longer presentation on this next month. Now, number 6, explain how skepticism produces knowledge. I don't think anybody ever said that skepticism produces knowledge. What skepticism does is prevent you from being fooled quite so easily, because we have a tendency to fact check, to test and to verify things. There's verificationism again. Remember that a fool is one who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence. And since the Bible and the Quran are both questionable sources of improbable claims, then it makes perfect sense why both of them use the exact opposite definition of a fool than people normally understand in common parlance. And finally, number 7, explain how atoms produce life when connected properly. It's just like the consciousness thing, where they think if you have enough synapses, you get the 600 million 51st synapse, and now you have intelligence where you didn't have it before. They don't understand what emergence is. They don't understand that emergence is a process. They don't understand that it's a gradation, right? Well, they think that life is something the same. You have to have this certain amount of complexity before, poof, it's alive. Before it becomes infused with the spirit or whatever the hell. This is a variant of the question that comes up all the time. How did life evolve? And it's fair to say that we don't know, but it's also misleading to say that. Because while we don't yet know every detail, and there are some important things we still haven't figured out, we've actually learned quite a lot over the last few decades, enough that we should now start to say what we actually do know. For example, we now know that the origin of life is a result of a succession or progression of several different unrelated yet cumulative chemical processes. And we know that none of these processes, we know what some of the processes are, and that they're none of them evolutionary processes. I've been following research in abiogenesis since I got into this topic, and I've combined every story or every study I know into a single summary explanation. I'm going to try to share that with you now. So welcome back to 5th grade biology. What we know of the early Earth is that it was much warmer and more radioactive than it is today, a bubbling cauldron cooking complex chemicals. And thanks to a series of different experiments by Yuri Miller, not just the famous one, but more successful or later variations, followed by a number of other similar experiments, we know that water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen generate amino acids when heated and charged with electricity. The same thing happens when you change the mix to include carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. Similarly, heating water to 70 degrees Celsius in the presence of iron hydroxide, simulating geothermal vents and anaerobic conditions on the prebiotic Earth, also produced amino acids and alpha hydroxy acids in the lab. A separate study showed that redox and pH gradients drive amino acid synthesis in iron oxyhydroxide mineral systems. Alanine and valine, two proteinogenic amino acids thought to be among the most abundant on the prebiotic Earth, also polymerize into peptides. Further studies show that it is remarkably easy for peptides to subsequently assemble into ordered protein-like two-dimensional structures, amyloids, from basic building blocks. This discovery supports the researchers' hypothesis that primal life could have evolved from amyloids such as these, because peptides can spontaneously form self-replicating protein structures in the presence of carbonyl sulfide. They also dry into polypeptides because some of these chemicals become increasingly complex after repeated cycles of inundation, dehydration, and irradiation. Then, once the right phosphate is involved, they become ribonucleotides. If ribonucleotides come into contact with montmorillonite, they spontaneously produce strands of RNA. Further laboratory experiments discovered a primordial soup that yields RNA bases. Activated RNA can not only replicate itself, even without the usual enzyme, it can also build DNA. And all research now favors the RNA first hypothesis for that reason. Biochemists now know of a ribozyme that can use either left or right-handed RNA templates to exclusively synthesize only right-handed versions, solving the problem of homochirality. And then, of course, phospholipids automatically form a bilayered cell wall upon contact with water due to their combined polarity, allowing a haven for all of these processes with transport vesicles and other semi-permeable channels to keep fueling and exchanging the system. So if RNA and then DNA are contained within that incidental arrangement, we have the basis of the first living cells. And one aspect of that is another question that creationists like to bring up only because they think you can't answer it. That is the appearance of intelligent design in what they think of as irreducibly complex structure of ATP synthase, which is an enzyme that is often deceptively illustrated to look like a diagram of a motor that you might find on sale at the home improvement depot. Researchers in Germany and Japan have illustrated a step-by-step progression in the development of ATP synthase, describing in detail how there was a single point mutation at one stage followed by a loss of function in this other gene, and then the subsequent duplication/fusion of a different gene followed by another loss of function in this other gene. And they showed how science could explain the sequence of how the structure was built, piece by piece, one mutation at a time, and how it changed functions at different times but remained functional at every stage. So it is not irreducibly complex. And no one who asks you to explain that wants to hear any of the explanation that I just gave you. If you put this all together, that is at least most of the explanation of the origin of life. There isn't a lot left to explain except for the formation of some organelles and some of the motorworks. And now scientists have even created a completely new and unique lifelike material that has metabolism and can self-reproduce. We want to keep that one under a lid. But creationists don't care about any of that because they don't want to understand it. They don't want anyone to understand it. They want it to remain misunderstood, insisting that explaining the origin of life should be as simple as adding water to a packet of powder. Or they want a machine where you dump in a mixture and a complex animal comes walking out of the other side in a minute. I think it's ironic that they're so impressed with how life is exceedingly complex, yet they reject a suitably complex explanation, opting instead for the simplest and most infantile excuse that men ever made up to explain anything. A god did it, essentially by magic. What creationists don't understand is that biochemical systems are so absurdly and unnecessarily complex that it shows that they're not intelligently designed, because if they were, they would be simpler and more efficient. They only ask unanswerable questions because they don't want answers. Believers like unexplained mysteries. That way you can supplement whatever you want to believe the answer is. And if you can't explain it, they don't want to hear it. And if you can't explain it, they think that's a gotcha. The best example I have of that was from my last job. If you all ever saw The Incredibles, remember Mr. Incredible worked in this cube farm, right? I had his job. I swear it looked exactly like that office. As a matter of fact, I did the exact same thing that he did. He was denying insurance coverage to little old ladies. That was my job. That was my last regular job. And if I were not already an atheist, that job would have convinced me that there's no such thing as a soul. And one day I got pulled into my boss's office just like Mr. Incredible did. And he asked me all the questions. We finally had that argument on belief, and he asked me all the questions that you would get from creationists. How can you believe that we evolved if there's no transitional species? So I start to tell him that, we have a list of hundreds of definite transitions, even according to the strictest definition of that word. But he didn't want to hear that answer. And so he asked me another one. Let's see, what was the other question he asked? Let's see, well, I'll skip that one. He says, how can you say we've evolved? We've never seen new species evolve. I just have to tell him, well, that macroevolution, also known as speciation, because they are the same thing, has been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field. But he interrupted again. He interrupts every answer to ask another question. He says, but explain why there's never been a beneficial mutation. And I begin to explain some of the ones that are already in the textbooks in our state. And then I was going to go on to list some of the others too, but he interrupted that too to ask another question. So, how can we come from apes if we're so different? Well, we are apes, both morphologically, and where did matter come from? Well, that's a different topic than evolution. We were talking about evolution, but, so what came before the Big Bang? Well, you can't technically have a time before time began. It's like, well, what started the Big Bang? Finally, after going through all of these questions, where I start to answer, he hears that I have an answer, he shuts me up, he asks me another question. He finally says, see, you come to a place where you don't know. You can't answer. And I have to point out to him that, see, you couldn't answer anything. Not the questions leading up to this, and not the question at the end, too. All you could do was ignore the fact that I had answers, because you don't want there to be answers. That was days before I realized that I'm on my last month at this job. I was there for 14 years, and I could see the writing on the wall. I know that I've got less than 30 days to get out. And so he was angry at me because, the reason he called me into his office, he was angry at me because I asked for time off to go to another country to give a speech to a panel of scientists. I said I was going to go to Ireland, I was going to share a stage with Richard Dawkins. I don't know, it was another one. I think it was maybe when I was going to Australia with Matt and Seth, and I told him I needed extra time off and all that. And these sorts of things. It was one of those. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was. But he thought that was undeserved, because he thought that if you're as smart as people think you are, then you would have better sales figures at your job here. So he thinks if you have expertise in any one field, it means you're good at everything you do, including the stuff you hate. Right? Can you imagine what a chef Hitler would have been? I mean, let's think. Let's say who's good at something? Einstein, right? Is he good at drifting? Can he drift? Can you think Einstein? No. But this is the way my boss was thinking about this. And so I realized that I'm about to be fired, and I didn't know what to do about that. My wife suggested that I put in a Patreon. The job had become so restrictive in the last year or so that, I wasn't able to do anything for my activism. I wasn't able to do anything for my channel anymore. And that's what it was. That's why he called me into his work, because I told him that my job interfered with my work. So I created an account on Patreon, which is the only way I could do anything, and that enabled me to be productive again. That's the only reason I can be here today. So I thank you for your support.